Welcome back from this very long break. I heard yesterday was pretty packed, so today you are kind of relaxing. Okay, this panel, the first panel of the afternoon, is called Collaborative Translations. And we have three panelists. I'm going to introduce one by one. So the first one is Federica Coluzzi. She's a Leverhulme Research Fellow at the University of Warwick. Prior to that, she was Irish Research Council Postdoctoral Fellow at the University College Cork. She is the author of Dante Beyond Influence, Rethinking Reception in Literary Culture, Manchester University Press, 2021, and the co-editor of The Afterlife of Dante's Vita Nuova in the Anglophone World, with Jacob Blaxley for Routledge, September 2022. She is an active member of the Center for Dante Studies in Ireland and Society of Italian Studies and early career academic representative. Her research encompasses reception theory and Dantean studies, 19th century periodicals, and the history of publishing and reading. Her work is published in Dante Studies, Biblioteca Dantesca, Tre Corone, Palgrave Encyclopedia of Victoria Women's Writing, Cosmo, Strumenti Critici, and so on and so forth. And the title of her talk today is Distantly Reading Women's Invisible Labor in Dante Translation History.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And thanks. Is it? Turn it on?
Should work.
Is it?
Yes, maybe we.
Can you hear me fine? Fine, yes? Okay, amazing. Lovely, thank you. So thanks very much to the organizers for accepting my proposal. I'm delighted to share this project with you all. So without further ado, I'll get a head start. So the role that translation has had in Dante's reception history cannot really be underestimated. What has passed dramatically unnoticed, however, is the extent to which women use translation to participate in the layered process of production, promotion, and dissemination of Dante knowledge. In today's talk, I will combine distant reading and close reading approaches to detail the number and variety of responses and forms of engagement with translation, thus recovering their individual specificity while eliciting trends and patterns of readerly and writerly behavior. The data will be drawn from my Modern Beatrice's archive that you see here, an open source digital archive built on Omecas, which recovers the lives and works of Italian, British, American, and Irish women writers active between the late 18th century and the first decades of the 20th. The archive now includes individual records for 196 women, 306 works, and 210 publishers. It uses prosopography, digital images, and data visualizations tools like GIS mapping, network analysis, and digital textual analysis to really rewrite individual and collective biographies, elicit connections, patterns of production, circulation, and reception of their works. The construction of a digital archive or a digital archival environment is motivated by the way digital archives really open unprecedented opportunities to reconceive the organizing principle of stored knowledge, making hidden text, materials, and past immediately apparent. The archive is still under development and will be launched at the Dante Global Female Public Conference that will be held in Warwick in September. And it will be complemented by the Dante Red database relating to women's material and intellectual history of reading Dante's works, evaluating individual specificities and transcultural continuities in their modes of reading and annotating and knowledge construction. Together, the Modern Beatrice's archive and the Dante Red aim to transform public understanding of women's role as producers, consumers, and popularizers of Dante knowledge across Italy, Britain, Ireland, and the US. And hopefully the archive will grant and increase the dissemination and usage of previously neglected collection items and enable new performance and exhibition through the creative and educational reuse of women's published works. However, if we look at it from a historical standpoint, the interception of Dante reception and women's intellectual and literary history occurred throughout the long 19th century within a broader context of socio-political and technological transformation. By the late 1770s, the Florentine poet was progressively rescued from barbarity in a lengthy process of rehabilitation vehiculated by the multiplication of English translations appearing in or complementing biographical accounts, literary accounts that were published in widely circulated periodicals. They were also featured in anthologies, linguistic and literary guides, and educational works. These interventions really reassured the British public that the Commedia was, and I quote, an epic poem replete with every characteristic of genuine poetry, a proper object of learning for both men and better educated ladies. And I'm quoting young ladies, I'm quoting an old source. As much as the reading woman was emerging as an historical reality increasingly significant in the literary marketplace, the figure of the woman translator as agent of cultural and linguistic mediation was progressively asserting itself in the public sphere. In her seminal study, Eliza Scholl has illustrated how, for Victorian middle-class women, the very ability to translate was a unique intellectual and material resource that not only granted them a more or less unmediated access to foreign ideas and high culture, but also was gave them a form of professional authority and social respectability as they entered into a cultural and ideological discourse with the source text, with the original text. Anglophone women, however, first engaged with translation as consumers. So critical, highly opinionated readers of the works of male translators like William Haley, the Irish clergyman early Henry Boyd, who was responsible for the first complete translation of the Commedia, and Henry Francis Carey, the author of the canon-making blank verse rendition that really brought Dante into the homes of generations and generations of Anglophone readers, and is still sold today. Judging the fidelity and the stylistic quality of these early translations was a preferred topic among women's epistolary networks of the late 18th and early 19th century. And the data collected from the Dante Red database signals that bluestocking writer and hostess Hans Seward, the playwright Mary Russell Mitford, Nancy Flaxman, Meta Gaskell, who was the daughter of Elizabeth Glasgow, are among the most voiceful commentators of the Commedia. And you can see here some comments. I cannot read, for instance, they talk about their experience of reading Dante in translation. They explore aspects and compare the different translations and judge which one they think is best. However, this is a form of private discourse, okay? But as women continue to assert themselves and assert their authority within the public sphere, these short comments and personal opinions that were expressed really in this enclosed, self-enclosed space progressively grew into more structured and far-reaching forms of translation criticism. And these images are taken from my archive. So, for instance, in 1867, the Victorian poet Cristina Rossetti penned an article on Dante for the Churchman Shilling magazine and Family Treasury. The debut in the arena of the public Dantismo that was so important to her family was prompted by yet another anonymous review. In this case, this was later ascribed to Julia Elizabeth Hassel, who was discussing 6 terza rima translations of the Commedia that had been published between 1851 and 1865. And although originally aimed at countering disparaging judgments of Cayley's one specific translation, her piece, Dante, an English classic, really exposed the attitudes and concerns at the art of 19th century discourse on English translations of the Commedia, while exemplifying the critical modes, the media environment in which translation history was becoming to be recorded. So Rossetti begins by theorizing the function of literary translation as an act of metaphorical reanimation, leading to a broader process of absorption and canonization into target culture, so Dante, an English classic. Then she goes on to expose and consider the most adequate form in which to render Dante the poem. So between those who stripped, she surveys those who stripped Dante to prose, chastened him into blank verse, or even deformed him by couplets or any other unauthorized vehicle, ultimately proclaiming that the terza rima was the best option. And when she talks about Cayley, and she was actually the editor, the assigned editor for a revised translation that was never published, really, but we have her marginalia on the edition. She thought that it was the fourth volume that was very, very important in this particular edition of the translation. That is the volume in which he put together all the notes, so the paratexts. And in this case, I think it's important because she starts to reflect upon the extension of the translator's function beyond interlingual translation. Is about reconceiving him as a hermeneutic mediator, someone who would provide the indispensable tools for solving what she called the keyless puzzle of the Commedia. And Rossetti's act of entrusting the final judgment to readers by providing a tableau of 4 passages from Cayley really shows, on the one hand, the power of and the role of the press in creating a public forum for readers to engage directly with translations and judge their value, but at the same time, periodicals were already offering themselves as sites for the vehiculation of early attempts at translating Dante on women's part. And this is what happened for many of them. So British traveller and folklorist Rachel Harriet Basque sent to Notes and Queries a version of Sonnet 25 from the Vita Nuova. Boston Catholic literary scholar, poet, and editor Louise Imogen Guiney, another American, she published multiple translations from Dante's Libello in the Critic, in the Church Review, and even there's a lot to be said about the choice of the specific periodical, but that's a whole other part of the research. At times, these kind of ephemeral publications found a more stable, permanent status once they were collected into volumes. And here, however, they were collected not in volumes of Dante translations, but actually in these translators' own poetic anthologies. So here again, once again, there is a blurring of the lines between the translator and the poet. In 1866, Mary Byard Clark included 2 sonnets from the Vita Nuova and then an extract from Francesca da Rimini's speech from Inferno 5. Once again, Louise Imogen Guiney published in The White Sail and the Other Poems, the blue volume that you see there, 4 sonnets from the Vita Nuova, and so on. However, the mid to late 19th century marked a turning point for women's participation in Dante book culture because, fueled by the international celebrations of the Dante Centenary in Florence in 1865, women writers entered the fiercely competitive marketplace and the overwhelmingly masculine subfield of Dante studies with book-length publications. And they authored translations, again, annotated and illustrated editions of Dante's works, companions, handbooks, biographies, historical studies, travel guides, and across all these publications, they adopted a wide range of strategies that can be subsumed under the rubric of translation. The framing paratext, I want to really concentrate on the framing paratext of handbooks and companions because they really reveal what I termed the functional, the critical use of embedded translations. So best-selling works like Maria Francesca Rossetti's A Shadow of Dante, published in 1872, and Margaret Oliphant's Dante, both saw the authors extend their intervention into the realm of translation. And for Rossetti, the intervention was directed to Dante's prose texts, the prose works that were lesser known, and their approach to translation was really to just bring it to the attention of the general reader. And here you can read her own attitude towards the principles of translation. For the Victorian popular novelist Margaret Oliphant, she entered the Aegon of Dante translations with a much more antagonistic attitude. So you can see here she surveys the body of translations that have been published up until that point, then focuses and expresses her preference for John Carlyle's prose translation of the Inferno, which was a very unorthodox choice, and then says to be translating herself the Purgatorio in Paradiso in rhyme. So she doesn't want to rely on anybody else, really, not on any man, really. And similarly, when she writes in the chapter on the Vita Nuova, she puts herself within the circle of Dante Gabriele Rossetti and Theodore Martin, who were the authors of the most, the best-selling, the most renowned translations of the Vita Nuova. So once again, she interjects the field in a sense. And throughout the second half of the 19th century, British and American writers began to produce fully bodied translations of Dante's works, reaching far beyond the Commedia. So we have in 1902 a translation of the Vita Nuova, and also the publication in the span of 2 years of 2 English versions of the Convivio. So the first one in 1887 and the next one in 1889. And these were 2 very different translations. The first one that you see here was just for general consumption and general reader. It didn't have any paratext, whilst Catherine Hillard's work was a much more traditionally scholarly edition with fully annotated, with a very lengthy introduction that tackled very vexed questions on the compositional history of the Convivio, on the role of the relation with the Commedia, the Vita Nuova and the Commedia, on the allegorical nature of Beatrice. And here, the one thing that is particularly interesting is the fact that Hillard, although she recognizes the importance of translation, she points the reader back to the original text, saying that the direct contact with the original text is essential for understanding it. And the fate of the first female author translation of the Divine Comedy comes from the pen of a Scottish writer, the Glasgow-born Claudia Hamilton Ramsey. And little is known about the composition history of the book, apart from the fact that she was living in Italy, and the old local dimension is quite important for many of them. My own archival investigations showed that in the 1880s, so after she published this translation, she lived in Florence and was a subscriber of the Gabinetto Vieussieux. And in 1871, she met in Florence Vernon Lee, who expressed appreciation for the translation, saying, "Her translation is the far best I know. Better than Carey, better than Wright, better than Longfellow, but it seems to have gained absolutely no reputation whatsoever." At this point is actually only partly true, because the work was widely reviewed and in a very positive manner in most British periodicals. They celebrated her as a thoroughly accomplished Italian scholar, who had preserved the spirit and meaning of the original singularly well. And they said that the London Review, for instance, said that Mrs. Ramsay deserved to be mentioned with respect among the translators of this mighty volume, finding in her courage, fidelity in the main, clearness, his superiority, and etc., etc., etc. And interestingly, the circle of translation circled back with Hassel's own review, who actually found the work too feminine. And I think here there's a lot to be said about the rhetorical strategies of reviewing and periodical reviewing, where women were actually playing along patriarchal approaches to women's work and gendered discourses. Ramsay's historical record remained unmatched until more than 50 years later. In 1914, E.M. Shaw published her own edition, her own translation of the Divine Comedy, and behind those initials actually lies the person of Edith Mary Shaw. And in the introduction, she presents her approach to Dante as a kind of inspired raptus, but actually in a letter written to Paget Toynbee, she presents it as a more intentional intervention into the male-dominated field of Dante studies, because she recounts that she felt surprised at a small number total of complete translations of the Commedia, and more so still that among them only 2 were written by women. And if this to be Mrs. Ramsay, one of them, then mine must be a necessity, must be the other one. And before Shaw, many women translators, Shaw basically recognizes the limitations, however, of signing a translation just with initials, because it leads reviewers to think that it's a man's work. However, this was quite common for many translators of the 20th century before her. So, for instance, Frances Isabella Fraser revealed the gender only by signing the preface to her translation of the Paradiso, whilst Agnes Louise Moni never revealed her identity. And her translation of the Purgatorio is a very slim volume, just bearing the text and some notes at the back. Most conspicuous, however, was the work done under pseudonym, under this just cryptic C of Caroline Potter, because Caroline Potter had authored 5 or 6 versions of her cantos from Dante. So basically in her hands, the Divine Comedy is not translated as a whole, but remarketed, repurposed into several disaligned cantos. And the result is awful, is honestly awful. It's not really a translation as much as a reimagination of the text. She cuts the length of the original by 25%, so it's a very complicated text, yes. But the fact that the volumes sold so well and she continued to produce them, establishing a very lengthy collaboration with Digby and Long, a London publisher, shows that there was a market. And the reason why there was a market was because all these translations were popularizing Dante, were giving the general reader, the rising middle classes, something to grapple with, something accessible, something adapt for a more socioculturally diverse, non-specialist readership. And to different extents and literary merits, these female author translations showed a renewed appreciation for the poet, for his oeuvre. So I want to conclude with this question. So now, when we are presented with an exclusively male literary tradition, and in this case, a male translation literary tradition, we must bear in mind that this is not because women did not quite or could not get published or went unacclaimed. Women qualified on all discounts. It was only later that they were disqualified. So how do we explain the transition from prominence to negation? What does it mean when women who were esteemed in their own lifetime are later denied or dismissed? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for this very rich paper, and also for perfectly keeping the time. So our next speaker is Anna Saroldi. Are you with us? Yes.
Needed to charge.
Okay, sure.
But I'm here.
Okay. She is a lecturer at the University of Oxford and obtained a doctorate of philosophy in English literature from the same institution. Anna's research focuses on translation and collaborative practices across English, Italian, and French in the 20th and 21st century. Anna is published on self-translation, heteroglossia, and retranslation from an archival perspective in authors such as Giampaolo Lahiri, Jacques Lyricet, and Vittorio Sereni, in journals such as Tricontre, Translation and Society, and forthcoming in translation studies in the Italian Institute. She is also a member of the Oxford Comparative Criticism and Translation Research Center and collaborates with the ITEM, Institut de Texte et Manuscrits Modernes Paris, research group on genetic translation studies at the École Normale Supérieure Paris. And the title of her talk today is Transalpine, Women and as Translators of Mountain Writing in the 20th Century. Thank you.
Does this work?
Yes.
It does. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. So with no further ado, I will start by addressing the elephant in the room. Why am I talking about mountaineering? How can mountaineering be a useful space to talk about translation and gender dynamics? So I'll start from this. I'll talk about the relationship between mountaineering literature and mountaineering fiction and gender dynamics. And from there, I will move to some of the findings of my research project. So mountaineering is an unusual sport, if indeed it can be considered a sport, in which narrative is everything. This happens for multiple reasons, and one of them is that a climbing story is the archetypical success story, as you can see in the slide. However, this also happens for other reasons. One of them is that each mountaineering achievement has a key phase that takes place off the mountain, which is the retelling of the expedition, also known as debriefing. This happens for quite an obvious reason. It's quite rare, though not impossible, that you can see a high altitude ascent. It's quite different, some of you have watched the Olympic Games in 2021, you've seen lead climbing, you've seen bouldering, and in cases like that, it's possible to grade and compare an achievement. With 8,000ers, it's not as simple. Also because it's subjective how hard it is. The conditions change, the party changes, the leaders change. And you might well know that the normal route to Everest is easier than the normal route to other 8,000ers. So because of that, writing about this becomes fundamental. So here I have a quote by Barcode who said, "To this day, mountain climbing remains the most literary of all sports. No other activity compels its participants, from the international star to the weekend scrambler, to turn each personal conquest into public tale. Contemporary alpine societies publish journals thick with memoirs of members' recent ascents. Mountaineering greatest athletes are also the genre best-selling authors." So as we said, why do mountaineers feel compelled to write? This is also to make money. And this has been going on since the 1920s. The key way to fund your expedition is sell the rights for a film or for talks, for photography. And this is not new. This has been there since the start of the century. As we've said, then, Julie Rack has also highlighted, and she's a scholar we'll be quoting a lot, that alpine climbing to this day and elite mountaineering remains non-quantifiable. So we don't have an objective scale of difficulty, we have a non-quantifiable sport, and we need a narrative to build consensus. Narrative that can be written, reconstructed, but it's always performed again to an audience. So this is the general link between mountaineering and literature, and then I will jump to what interests me more, and that's the link between mountaineering and literary translation and the practices of literary editing. As Pascal, I took the liberty of putting a Netflix quote here. I don't know, those of you who have seen The Irish Wish, strongly recommend. So the link between mountaineering and translation is interesting because historically they've been viewed through a predominantly male lens and linked to opposite gender assumptions. So we talk about current gender norms and crystallized roles. We cannot not talk about mountaineering. Historians such as Peter Hansen have analyzed the tension between romanticism, exploration, and masculinity in books such as The Summits of Modern Man, and similar themes have been explored by anthropologists such as Wade Davies, who looked at the connection between the First World War and the first British Everest expeditions. So the role of gender norms is fundamental in mountaineering, to the point that mountaineering has been defined as hyper-masculine by anthropologists such as Frolick. Another sociologist, Delphine Moraldo, has said that codified, thought out, and told mainly by men, excellence in mountaineering was and is understood, conceived, and perceived as male. So clearly, this is evident in mountain reports, when there's not just a gender, but there's also a race-based opposition that emerges, separating real mountaineers from women and Sherpas and other indigenous populations. This is also possible when you have British people going to the Alps. That's another foreigner to objectify. Conversely, translation, as we've said, translation and practices of editing have had the reputation of being a womanly endeavor, as Lindsay Lohan is showing here. They're lesser and feminized in comparison to the original, and in this more suited to women. I would quote Chamberlain, but we've all said it in these days. So far, not much attention has been paid to the relationship between mountaineering literature and translation. One of the few articles that talks about this is another article by Julie Rack, where she's talking about Mémoire d'un Sherpa, which is a French book. It's the memoir of Ang Tarke, who was a key member of the first expeditions of the 1950s. And the book is already a complex book because it was originally published in French, but it was based on the English translation of a conversation had in Hindi with Tarke. So we already have various levels of mediation. And Rack is reading this book, and since it's one of the very few books about a local indigenous guide, she's asking, since the text is so heavily mediated, can we read Sherpa is the English title of the book, as Tarke's memoir, as a life story? How can we find Tarke's voice in the text? So this, to me, is an interesting question. She's not talking about translation per se in the text, but I would read it in this frame. And in addition to this, for me, what's really interesting is to ask how the histories of mountaineering have been transmitted and by whom. So a focus on writing and translation dynamics in mountaineering literature reveals that the making of this culture is transnational, and it's highlighting figures that have previously been sidelined because of their gender and their role as translators and editors. So my research is highlighting a long and underexamined history of women. Here I'm adopting women trans inclusively in the mountaineering community, not just as climbers, but also as writers, as editors and translators who played a key role in the transmission of the narratives, defining the meaning of mountains in the 20th and 21st century. So as I want to demonstrate, and this actually ties in very well with what Federica was saying, while on the surface mountaineering history and its literature look predominantly male, the canon and transmission have been determined by women agents. So I started by looking at Britain, partially because it's where I'm based, but also because of the very important cultural value the mountaineering has for Britain and has had, possibly still has, for the empire as an idea. But I'm expanding this research to other alpine languages and cultures, such as Italian and French. This is for the general frame, and now I will go to some of the case studies. So this is Janet Adams-Smith, and my first example, my first study is on her and Nia Morin. I will say Nia Morin, Nia Morin, both are possible, depends how I feel with the pronunciation. So they're two British climbers born in 1905, who are very interesting because they both climbed and translated together. So the relationship between mountaineering as a practice and the translation of literature is also interesting because there's a collaborative translation going on at the same time as the choice of the cordée féminine, so mountainless climbing or all-female climbing. They also both wrote about the stories, so they published climbing memoirs. Here you can see Mountain Holidays, and Nia Morin wrote A Woman's Reach, which is a quote of Browning. Well, change quote, because Browning, of course, saying man's reach. So I won't describe their biographies or how they got into climbing, how they learned French, but I just wanted to highlight a few important points. The memoirs are fundamental. These are some of the very rare examples of mountaineering nonfiction written by women, and especially because they both published around the mid-20th century. And even today, adventure writing is still lacking diversity, and these examples also specifically talk about what it means to them to be a woman and climb, so they're really important exceptions. As you can see, in particular in Morin's case, the title is A Woman's Reach, so we have the gender question already at the title of the book. And there's also in the book a chapter on women climbing, and there's an appendix with a survey of notable ascents. And this idea of creating a genealogy is a traditional feminist practice. So we can see an awareness of the history of women climbing and a desire and a commitment to preserve it. The other important thing is that climbing and translation reciprocally make each other possible. So the two of them met climbing. They met with the Ladies Alpine Club, but they already respected and knew each other's writing, and they liked their styles. They're chosen as translators of mountaineering literature because they have alpine experiences, because they know the languages, but in turn, they can afford the alpine seasons because of the money they made translating. So text and mountain are nurturing and sustaining each other, and they're proving once again that mountain literary efforts are interconnected. So from the perspective of the history of women translators, we should also note that in this case, the collaborative network was also done to help each other with families, and they were both widows, so often they were translating together because they had kids and a family, and so they were supporting each other in this scenario. So this was for their biographies, and these are the sources, and these are the books they translated. So what's interesting to me is not just the stories, but also the texts they've translated. In particular, one that became very successful, and it's Annapurna by Maurice Herzog, and it's one of the most famous mountaineering books of all times. It was published in 1951. I think in France it was obligatory in school for a while. I think Herzog became Minister of Sport. Well, anyway, he probably forced people to read it. Annapurna is a revolutionary book in many respects, and has a final line that in English became really famous because it says, "There are other Annapurnas in the lives of men." And it's one of the most quoted mountaineering citations, which has inspired a generation of climbers to take up climbing, and it's also connecting contemporary climbing achievement with romantic ideals of struggle, of suffering, and of purity of heart. So I wanted to analyze the translation of Annapurna, so I took as point of reference Rack's book, False Summit, and her study of gender dynamics in Annapurna. I made a list of the passages that Rack is analyzing, and Rack is basing her work on the 1952 translation, and I looked for the French counterpart in Herzog 1951. So what's going on with all the gender stereotypes and similar things? So in most cases, as we can imagine, the translation is preserving the gender discrimination of the French text. Of course, this should not surprise us. Translators are embedded in a historical and social context, and translation is often a child of its own ideological time. So very often we see the same biases and the sexism present in certain passages of the text. However, in some passages, things change. So there's an important section of Annapurna where Herzog is coming down the mountain. Basically, he stayed on the summit too long, and he didn't have gloves. Don't do that. So he's coming down, he's getting frostbite, and he's crying and he's afraid. And Rack is reading the English text, and he's saying that this doesn't make him childish or womanly. This behavior is not something that creates ridicule, but greater understanding in her analysis. The analysis of Rack might be true and hold true for the English text, and the gendered perception in particular here is what interests me. But if we go to the French text, we see that there's something quite different going on. So what in English is just childish fears, in French is specifically gender. So genre de m'inquiétude de petite fille. I'm not saying there's a specific feminist agenda behind that. I'm just saying that there's a change that's going on, and we should be aware of that when we make a reading of a mountaineering text. We have similar examples like that. So we have in French, bande de petites filles, crie la chenal furieux, which becomes in English, you're a pair of sissies, growled la chenal crossly. So in this case, we could say, oh, it's no longer petite fille, the sexism is toned down, yeah, but the homophobia is going up. Because sissies at the time signified girlish men, and so gay men. So there's a certain gendered reading of the book, which could have been different if we'd based it on the French text. Another one, which is a bit more political, we have in French, nous ne sommes pas des Sherpas, s'écrit la chenal, ce n'est pas pour porter que nous sommes venus dans l'Himalaya, appuie rebuffa, which in English becomes, we're not Sherpas, said la chenal bitterly, we didn't come to the Himalayas to be beasts of burden, growled rebuffa. So what's going on here? Adam Smith and Morand are intensifying the implication of porter, as they're adding beasts. Of course, beasts of burden is an idiomatic expression, so there is a metaphor, but the metaphor is not present in French. And this is intensifying a reading we can already build on a French text, which is based on stereotypes about Sherpas, assumptions about class position, and the idea that guides are also beasts when they're working at home. So a guide in the Alps is like a Sherpa in the Himalayas. And this is all closely imbricated with ideas about masculine strength and sacrifice, and the idea fundamentally that appears later in the book, the Sherpa men must do the jobs of animals and women. So as I've said, I'm not claiming that one reading of this memoir of the first Annapurna ascent is true or better, because they both exist in the world in the same time, and I'm not very involved with the idea of the original text. I simply argue that the understanding of gender and of race and of class and of nationhood in mountaineering writing can be enriched and complicated by looking at the translation process behind it, at the agents, at the texts, and by accounting for the instability and variation, as unstable and variating are gender performances and norms. So to approach my conclusion, in the case we've analyzed, Morand and Adam Smith are invisible as women, as translators, as female mountaineers, and this is all combined. We've seen that women are present in the fabric of mountaineering, they're making history in multiple roles, and they're also made invisible, we were talking about this yesterday, under different lenses. Morand and Adam Smith, and many more, were able to bring a different kind of contribution to mountaineering communities, not just by ascending new peaks, which they did, but by providing access to stories and the past of mountaineering history, retelling the stories and making them more widely accessible. So a final note, why is this important? We're all familiar with translation differences, so why does it matter to talk about them in a mountaineering context? I have a few reasons, few options. I will start with 4. So from a translator studies perspective, and women translator studies history, this is interesting because it widens and expands our understanding of the kind of jobs and professions translators might have. So we know that translators have multiple jobs. Usually, though, we're thinking of related literary jobs. We're thinking people working as journalists, as critics, as reviewers, as lecturer, perhaps. We're not thinking of outdoor professionals. Secondly, focusing on the mountaineering community and on the literature of the 1920s to 1950s works well because it's a case study that's small, it's tightly knit, it's international, and it's a mountaineering community. So it's relatively easy to highlight the key agents, the nodes of the translation mediation process, and it gives us a portrait of a revolutionary community that was defying current norms and defining them. Thirdly, and this is the most important point, mountaineering is important if we decide to focus on women not as an accident. So if we're not just studying women because they're not very studied, because from that perspective we could be studying literary marmots, but if we study women because this is a trans-feminist and a decolonial choice, then mountaineering is an ideal field. Because mountaineering has been the archetypical space to conceptualize gender and race difference, to define to whom the mountains and nature and landscapes, the outdoors, and their stories belonged. So from this perspective, it's important because it's the archetypical white male space, and it gives us a special focus to shed light on the dual process of domination and emancipation, and with the tension between suffering and subverting that these women are playing with. So if the translator is a woman and she's a mountaineer, we must ask how she reacts, if she reacts, to textualize male domination and how she's working with it. So finally, when I started doing this, mine was also a reaction to a certain approach to gender and queer studies. I would say that gender studies by now has realized the importance of mountaineering as a key space of formalization of Western gender norms in the modern and contemporary period. But often there's a focus on these texts as if written in English. So there's an erasure of the multilingual dimension of the mountaineering community and the very status of mountains as linguistic borders. I didn't go into that, but language and mountains is already a big topic because most communities and most professionals have to be multilingual to operate in this space. So to conclude, often we can find Annapurna quoted in English just with Herzog's name and no credit given to Janet and Nia. Famously, Alene Blum, another prominent mountaineer who went to Annapurna, played with the ending of Herzog's book, adding, well, so Herzog is saying there are many Annapurnas in the lives of men, and Blum is saying in the lives of women as well. Yet, invisibly, women were already there, not on the summit, like in Blum's expedition, but behind the pages of the text, already shaping and defining mountaineering culture, even when it looked like it was only made of and written by men. Thank you.